It all started on a quiet night, the kind where time feels suspended and heaven seems a little closer to the earth. You had been restless for weeks, caught in a cycle of prayer and wondering, asking God for answers that never seemed to come. You weren't asking for riches, you weren't asking for fame, you were asking for something deeper, confirmation. Was your heart just dreaming, or had heaven really whispered a name to your spirit? There's something sacred about waiting. Yeah, it's not just the passage of time, it's the molding of the soul. And you had been in that waiting room for longer than you wanted to admit. The promises spoken over your life, some in dreams, some through strangers who didn't even know your name, still lingered in the air like incense. They spoke of a union unlike any other, a marriage ordained not by man, but by God, a connection so profound the earth would shake when your hands touched. You tried to let it go, to move on, to stop hoping, but something wouldn't let you. And then it happened. It was around 3:17 a.m. when you woke up, heart pounding, the room lit not with natural light, but a presence, not fear, not dread, just holy. You didn't have to see him to know he was there. Archangel Michael, the warrior of heaven. The one who fights for destinies, who breaks chains, who silences the voices of hell when they come too close to your future. And he spoke, not through your ears, but straight into your spirit. His voice wasn't just sound, it was authority. Wrapped in peace, he said, "You've waited because this wasn't just any marriage, this is covenant. Heaven has recorded it. Your union is not late, it's being perfectly aligned. Look at this name now." Then it appeared, written not in ink but in light. A name that made your heart race and your knees go weak. You knew that name. You'd heard it whispered before. Once in a dream, once in a random prayer, someone prayed over you without understanding why. But this time it wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. Everything around you shifted. The air felt electric, and your memories began connecting the dots. That name had always lingered near the edges of your story. Passing glances, quick interactions, strange coincidences that never made sense until now. You remembered the time you bumped into them on a day you weren't even supposed to be out. The way their eyes held yours for a second too long. The feeling you couldn't shake after they left, and the dreams. Oh, the dreams. You tried to ignore them, chalk them up to wishful thinking. But what if they weren't? What if the dreams were divine previews? What if God had been gently nudging you all along? You got out of bed and dropped to your knees. There were no words left, just a deep trembling in your soul. Something ancient had been activated. This wasn't about dating or romance. This was about legacy, about purpose, about two lives ordained to walk as one, carrying out an assignment bigger than either of you alone. And Michael wasn't done. His next words rang through your being like thunder wrapped in honey. There is warfare around this connection because it is holy. The enemy has fought to delay it, to distract you, to cause you to doubt. But heaven has declared, it is time. And now it will begin. You felt something break in the spirit realm. The years of confusion, of wondering if you were delusional, began to melt away. Clarity came like a sunrise after a long night. This was real. And the name, it wasn't just familiar. It was right. It was chosen. It was sealed by the breath of God. You whispered the name aloud, and heaven echoed it back to you. You didn't know all the details yet, how it would happen, what would shift, or how they would come to know what you now knew. But one thing was sure. The supernatural marriage that had been prophesied, prayed for, and protected was now in motion, and the Archangel Michael, sword drawn, stood guard over it. You stood slowly, tears still clinging to your face, heart still thudding in awe. Something deep inside you, something eternal was awakening. You weren't just preparing to meet your spouse, you were being prepared to step into divine destiny, shoulder to shoulder with the one heaven had written into your story before. Time began, because when God ordains a marriage, the whole universe rearranges to bring it to pass, and now you would begin to see it. You didn't go back to sleep that night. How could you? The weight of what you'd just experienced didn't settle like fog. It came down like fire. It lit up every corner of your mind, every question you'd once tucked away into silence. You weren't confused anymore. You were convicted. There's a difference. The name still hovered in your spirit, alive like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a person, it was a calling. The way their name had been revealed, it didn't feel random. It felt ancient, like heaven had been rehearsing this moment over and over until you were ready to finally see it. You walked quietly to the kitchen, trying to steady your hands enough to pour a glass of water. But the tremble wouldn't go away. It wasn't fear, it was reverence, like you'd just touched the edge of a divine secret, and now nothing would ever feel ordinary again. God had spoken. Michael had confirmed it, and you knew something had shifted in the atmosphere around you. The spiritual delay was over. The warfare that had clouded your vision, all the lies the enemy had whispered, "You're too late, you missed it, they don't even know you exist." Those voices were suddenly silent, their power broken, and in the quiet that followed, something holy rose up. You thought back on all the times you questioned if you were lovable, all the seasons you wondered if maybe marriage just wasn't in the cards for you. How many times had you prayed and felt like heaven was silent? How many nights had you cried behind closed doors, smiling through pain during the day like nothing was missing? But something had been missing. Not just a person, but the piece of you that was created to walk in tandem with theirs. You didn't need someone to complete you. God had already done that. But you needed the one who would complement you in divine purpose, who would hold your hand when the storms came, who would carry your burdens like sacred treasure. And they had a name. You whispered it again just to hear how it sounded with your breath behind it. And when you did, something inside of you softened. There was no striving in that name, no anxiety, just peace. It was the name of the one who would look at your scars and call them beautiful, who would hear your silence and understand the language of your soul. This wasn't about falling in love the way the world defined it. This was about rising into it. You sat in the stillness, letting the revelation wash over you in waves. Every prophetic word you'd ever received about divine connection started coming back to memory. Even the ones you'd dismissed because they felt too hopeful. They all pointed here, to now, to this very moment where your spirit finally caught up with what heaven had already written. Michael had said this union was fought over, that the enemy had tried to delay it. You began to understand why. This kind of love, it's rare. It's the kind that doesn't just heal individuals. It births ministries, shifts atmospheres, and rewrites generational narratives. The kind that makes hell nervous. You remembered one dream in particular, one that had haunted you for months. In it, you were standing at the edge of a battlefield, sword in hand, surrounded by shadows. You felt overwhelmed, exhausted, but then someone appeared beside you. They didn't say a word, but they reached out, took your hand, and everything changed. The shadows began to retreat. That dream made no sense when you first had it, but now you understood. That person, that name, was more than just a spouse. They were your battle partner, not just someone to marry, but someone to war with, in prayer to believe with, to build with. Someone who wouldn't run from the fire, but walk into it with you, because they were forged in the same flame. God wasn't just answering your longing for love. He was fulfilling a divine blueprint. Heaven wasn't responding to your loneliness. It was unveiling your assignment. You began to see how the enemy had targeted both of you. How distractions, toxic relationships, insecurities, and delays had all been part of a calculated plan to keep this union from happening. But Michael had shown up to say, "It is time. The war is turning in your favor now." There's something that happens when you finally see it, when you finally believe that what God spoke isn't just a hope but a heavenly decree. Your posture changes, your prayers become bolder, your discernment sharpens, and your spirit stops settling for less. Because once heaven reveals who, you stop entertaining what doesn't align. You stood from the kitchen table, feeling different. Not just awake, but activated. You knew this wasn't something to chase, it was something to prepare for. Heaven wasn't asking you to find them. It was telling you to be ready. Ready for recognition, ready for conversation, ready for confirmation in the natural that matched what had already been revealed in the Spirit. You didn't know how or when, but one thing was certain: they would know. 2. Heaven wouldn't whisper your name to them without also stirring their heart the same way, because God doesn't write one-sided stories, and when your eyes finally met, the wait would make sense. The morning sunlight began to break through the blinds, but it felt like a different kind of day. The world hadn't changed, but you had. The weight of what you carried now was invisible, but undeniable, the kind of knowing that sits in your bones. Not just an idea, not a fantasy, but a revelation from the throne room. You walked slower that morning, each movement more intentional. It wasn't just another day, it was a day after. The day after the encounter, the day after the name, the day after heaven whispered what your heart had been begging to hear for years. Your spirit was still wrapped in awe. The voice of Archangel Michael still echoed in your chest. This is covenant, this is holy, look at this name now. That wasn't just a suggestion, that was a divine announcement. You had been summoned into alignment, you kept replaying it, how it all unfolded. You weren't even praying for a visitation. You weren't asking for a sign. You were just exhausted, tired of pretending you were okay with silence, tired of wondering if your discernment had betrayed you, and yet, in the middle of that surrender, heaven came rushing in. God tends to do that. Right at the edge of your strength, when your hands are empty, He fills them. And now they were full, not with a person yet, but with prophecy. A word that held more weight than the last 10 years of heartbreak. So, what now? That question followed. You through the day, not from a place of fear, but readiness. You weren't walking around hoping for a miracle anymore. You were the miracle in motion. Your steps were different. You were no longer searching. You were preparing. Because when God speaks, you don't chase, you steward. You took out a journal and wrote the name. You didn't decorate it with hearts or dreams. You surrounded it with prayer. You put a hedge around it in the Spirit. Because this wasn't just your person. This was your spiritual partner. The one your future needed to walk with. The one whose voice would echo your own in prayer. The one who would see you, truly see you, and not flinch. They didn't know yet. Maybe they were still fighting battles of their own. Maybe they were still asking the same questions, still wrestling in the dark. Maybe they'd seen your face before, even felt a tug they couldn't explain, but hadn't connected the dots. But heaven was moving on both sides now. And Michael, he wasn't just a messenger, he was your defender. You could feel it. The air around you was charged with angelic presence. Things that used to shake you didn't rattle your spirit anymore. Doubt tried to creep in, but it didn't land. The roots of this word went too deep. You started remembering the scriptures that used to bring comfort, but now carried new power. Verses about covenant, about divine timing, about how no good thing would He withhold from those who walk uprightly. You weren't perfect, but you were postured. And heaven responds to posture more than perfection. There were days you questioned if God even heard your prayers. Now you knew. He not only heard them, He had been recording them, bottling every tear, every whispered why. And now, those bottles were tipping. Answers were pouring. You glanced again at the name. It stirred something tender and fierce. At the same time, how could one name carry so much? It was like a thread had been pulled, unraveling the veil over your eyes. Now, when you looked at your past, everything was clearer. The delays weren't denials. They were divine detours. If you had gotten what you wanted too early, you wouldn't have recognized what you truly needed. You remembered the times you tried to settle, the moments you chose safe over sacred, how your spirit always felt slightly off, like you were wearing someone else's armor. But you pushed through, tried to make it work, until God, in His mercy, shut the doors you didn't have the courage to walk away from. You didn't know then, but He was preserving you, keeping you hidden. Because when something is holy, it doesn't get rushed. It gets refined. And you had been refined. So had they. Your paths were being cleared. Heaven had removed the fog. And now there was no going back to pretending you didn't know what you now knew. The world would call it coincidence. Your friends might call it a crush. But your spirit knew better. This wasn't butterflies. This was blueprint. And somewhere, in another room, maybe even another city. They were beginning to feel it too. A shift in the air, a stirring, a dream, a name, yours. Heaven doesn't tease. God doesn't play with hearts. When he speaks, he builds. And what he was building now would not be shaken. The angels were already ahead of you, aligning the timing, clearing the noise. Preparing both of you for the divine collision that was already scheduled, you closed the journal slowly, whispering one simple phrase, "Lord, make me ready." That prayer, "Lord, make me ready," wasn't a plea born of desperation. It was a declaration, a surrender soaked in confidence, not in yourself, but in the God who authored this entire journey. And once you said it, you could feel the response echo through the heavens. The preparation had already begun. But this wasn't the kind of preparation you thought it would be. It wasn't about how you dressed, or what you posted, or how many relationship sermons you could cram into a week. No, this was deeper. God was working beneath the surface, in the places you rarely let anyone reach. The hidden places, the rooms of your soul where old wounds still echoed, where trust had been broken, where fears whispered, "What if it all falls apart again?" That's where he started. And he started with fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that purifies. The kind that doesn't burn you, it frees you from lies you believed about yourself, from soul ties you thought you had let go of, from shame that still wore your name like a second skin. Because before you could step fully into this covenant, God had to make sure your heart could hold it. A supernatural marriage isn't built on attraction. It's built on assignment, and assignments come with weight. Michael had said this was a divine partnership. That meant you weren't just receiving a spouse. You were receiving a mission, a mantle, a kingdom call that required both of you to be spiritually alert, emotionally mature, and unshakably anchored in your identity. So God started stripping things away. He pulled down idols you didn't even realize you had. Not golden statues, but expectations. The way you thought this would look, the timeline you created, the fantasy you clung to. Because if you were going to receive what was real, you had to let go of what was ideal. That was hard. There were moments you wanted to go back to before the revelation, before the name. Back when it was easier to just hope vaguely than believe specifically. But you couldn't unsee what heaven had revealed. The name had been sealed in your spirit, and it wouldn't leave. Not because you were obsessed, because you were awakened. This wasn't romantic infatuation, it was spiritual recognition. You didn't want them because you were lonely. You were drawn to them because your spirit saw something eternal in them, something that mirrored your own calling, something that felt like home, even from a distance. You began praying for them, not just about them. Prayers that weren't self-centered but selfless. You interceded for their peace, their healing, their clarity. You began to see them not just as yours, but as God's beloved. A whole person with their own journey, their own scars, their own mountaintops and valleys, and something holy happened in that posture. You stopped trying to force it. You stopped asking God when. You started thanking Him for the process, for the becoming, for the hidden work that no one else could see, because you weren't just waiting, you were becoming. And somewhere, they were becoming too. Maybe they were having their own encounter. Maybe their angelic messenger had already whispered your name. Maybe they had scribbled it down in a notebook just like you had. Or maybe they were still in the fog, still asking God for clarity. Either way, God was moving. You could feel the evidence in little things. A dream here, a confirmation there. Random conversations that circled back to marriage, to timing, to purpose. Songs that hit different. Scriptures that glowed when you read them. Moments where your heart beat a little faster, like heaven was, tapping your shoulder. It wasn't all joy, though. There were still days of doubt. The enemy didn't roll over and quit just because heaven spoke. In fact, his attacks intensified. Distractions showed up in charming disguises. Old feelings tried to resurrect. Impatience came knocking. But you were different now. You didn't entertain what didn't align. You didn't give energy to what didn't reflect the prophecy. You had tasted clarity, and nothing counterfeit could satisfy that hunger anymore. There's something powerful about a person who knows what's theirs. They don't grasp. They don't chase. They prepare. They pray. They walk with expectation, not anxiety. That was you now. You weren't sitting around twiddling your thumbs waiting for a love story to drop out of the sky. You were building, growing, becoming the kind of person who could carry the weight of covenant with strength, humility, and joy. Because this wasn't about just saying, I do. This was about saying, I will, to the calling, the assignment, the spiritual legacy that this union would unlock. So you kept showing up, in prayer, in discipline, in obedience, even when it felt quiet, even when you couldn't feel them. Because the promise wasn't based on your feelings, it was anchored in faith. And faith says, if God spoke it, it will come to pass. You didn't need to manufacture a moment. You just had to remain in position, because heaven had already spoken, and the angels were still moving. The days began to stretch like silk, quiet but charged with meaning. You started seeing signs in small moments, not in flashing neon, but in the whisper of divine rhythm. Nothing loud, nothing forced, but everything was lining up in ways that could only be heaven. One morning, while sipping your coffee, a verse you hadn't read in years popped into your mind. He makes all things beautiful in its time. And for the first time, you believed it without a trace of hesitation, not just for others, not just in theory, for you. God wasn't just arranging a meeting, he was choreographing a masterpiece. And the beauty of it? You didn't have to strive, you didn't have to manipulate. The pressure was off. What had once felt like a heavy ache, wanting to be chosen, seen, loved, was being replaced with peace. Because now you knew you were already chosen, already seen, already loved, not just by them, but by the one who called this covenant into existence in the first place. Archangel Michael's words still lived in your soul like fire etched in stone. Look at this name now. And you had. Not just once, not out of obsession, but in reverence, in faith, in obedience. You didn't parade it around. You didn't go announcing to the world that God told you who your spouse was. That wasn't the assignment. This was sacred. Hidden in the secret place, protected by prayer. Because holy things are safest in silence until God says it's time to reveal. So you kept the name tucked in your spirit like a seed, and you watered it, not with worry, but with worship. That's when the dreams intensified. Not always crystal clear, but enough to confirm this wasn't your imagination. This was movement. You'd wake up with a name on your lips, or a sense of their emotions, as if the Holy Spirit was giving you glimpses of what they were walking through. You didn't always understand it, but you carried it anyway. Quiet intercession became part of your rhythm, because even before they showed up, you were learning how to cover them. And there were moments, beautiful, unexplainable moments, when you felt like your spirits were brushing against each other, like your prayers were colliding in the heavenlies, two voices rising like incense before the throne, unaware of each other in the natural, but deeply aware in the supernatural. This wasn't just emotional. This was eternal. It didn't make sense to anyone else, and it didn't have to. Your obedience wasn't up for debate. You didn't need consensus, you just needed confirmation, and heaven had already given it. Still, you lived your life fully. You laughed, you worked, you rested. You served. You weren't waiting in a corner for someone to show up and complete you. You were already whole. You were just making space for divine addition. Because the right person doesn't complete you, they complement the call on your life. And the deeper God brought you into this season, the more you started to understand what this marriage would actually be. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about commission. Two callings converging, two flames combining to burn brighter. This wasn't about romance alone. It was about revival. You thought you wanted someone to love you, but God was giving you someone who would war with you, in prayer, in purpose, in spirit. That's what made it supernatural. Anyone can fall in love, but only heaven can ordain a covenant that shakes the kingdom of darkness. So you waited, but not with a passive heart. Your waiting was active, alive. You were listening, preparing, discerning. You stopped entertaining distractions. You stopped letting loneliness dictate your decisions. Because what God promised required purity of focus. There would be temptations, oh, there would be. Counterfeits don't just show up looking like red flags. They come wrapped in everything you once asked for, minus the God piece. And you'd have to stay sharp, because timing is everything. Marrying the right person at the wrong time is still a disaster. But you were learning to recognize the counterfeit, not by how it looked, but by how it felt in your spirit. God was tuning your discernment, teaching you to recognize His signature. His fingerprints were all over this promise, and you were learning to wait for the match that bore His mark. You weren't afraid of missing it anymore, because God is not cruel. He wouldn't reveal a name. They promise a purpose, only to let it slip away. What's from Him is sustained by Him. You don't have to beg for it, manipulate it, or chase it. You just have to align with it. So that's what you did. You got back in your secret place. You kept the altar burning. You whispered their name in prayer, not asking God to rush it, but to ready it, to make them bold, faithful, whole. Because you wanted a partner, not a project. And you trusted that God was doing the same work in them that He was doing in you. 2 flames, 2 assignments, 1 purpose, the kind of love that doesn't just hold hands, it holds heaven. And soon you sensed, very soon, those flames would finally collide. The shift didn't come with fireworks. It came like a wind, subtle but undeniable. You couldn't explain it logically, but your spirit knew something had turned. Heaven had leaned in. The atmosphere around you changed. The way you prayed felt different. The way you listened, even the way you waited. This was no longer preparation. This was alignment. God had been walking you through a long corridor of faith, and now you stood at a door, and you weren't afraid to knock. There was no more anxiety about timing, no more wondering if you'd missed your chance. You had outgrown those fears. You weren't desperate for a miracle, you had become one. A living testimony that God really does prepare His people for promise. You were the version of yourself your old prayers were asking for. And that's when heaven whispered again. This time, it wasn't a loud revelation. It wasn't a booming voice or a flash of light. It was quiet, so quiet you almost missed it. But Archangel Michael's presence stirred around you like a still breeze that moved deep things. A knowing dropped into your spirit, and it wasn't brand new. It was a reminder, the name, the one you were told to look at. You had seen it, prayed over it, carried it. And now, suddenly, you felt the weight of it change. It didn't feel distant anymore. It didn't feel like a question. It felt close, like breath, like something brushing past your shoulder in the spirit. You knew the time was near, not because of a feeling, but because of the fruit. God had matured you, not just emotionally, but spiritually. You no longer prayed for a person to fix you. You prayed to partner with someone, to walk together in covenant, to serve together, war together, build legacy that echoed into eternity. And you understood now, this wasn't about falling in love. This was about rising into purpose. Because when heaven writes the script, the love story doesn't end at the altar, it begins there. And it overflows into generations, into communities, into spiritual territory that would never have been reached if the two of you stayed apart. That's why the battle had been so intense, because the enemy didn't just fear your love, he feared your assignment. Every delay, every disappointment, every heartbreak before this, it wasn't just about trying to steal your joy. It was about trying to block this union from coming forth. Because this marriage, it would break chains, not just for you, but for others. This was a kingdom connection with kingdom consequences. You understood now why Michael was the one who came to deliver the message. This wasn't just romantic, it was warfare. And that's what made it sacred, because you didn't want a fairy tale anymore. You wanted fire, purpose, holiness. You wanted someone who wouldn't just love the parts of you that were easy, but would stand beside you in the trenches, call you higher, cover you in prayer, and storm heaven with you when the battle got thick. You didn't want someone who completed your Instagram aesthetic. You wanted someone who would partner with your prophetic destiny, and that's exactly who God was preparing you for. It wasn't about being ready in the sense of perfection. It was about being surrendered, available, obedient. And now, your spirit was ready to walk through whatever door God opened, even if it looked different than you expected, even if it required courage, because perfect love had cast out fear, And you weren't waiting anymore. You were moving, following prompts, obeying nudges, making space in your calendar, in your heart, in your home, not out of assumption, but expectation. Faith without works is dead, and your faith was alive. You didn't need confirmation after confirmation anymore. You knew, and knowing brings peace that transcends logic. The kind of peace that says, I don't have to see the full picture to trust the painter. So you stopped checking your phone 100 times a day. You stopped overanalyzing their silence. You stopped playing detective with signs and timelines. You rested, you released. You rejoiced, even before it came, because you trusted the one who promised, and that trust was your superpower. You weren't just believing for a spouse, you were believing for an encounter, a divine collision, something only God could orchestrate. And you sensed it was closer than you thought. You weren't the same person who first heard the name. Back then you were uncertain, cautious, hesitant. But now you were bold, and when the moment finally came, whenever, however God chose, you wouldn't flinch. You wouldn't shrink back. You'd recognize it for what it was, a sacred unveiling of something heaven had been building all along, and you'd be ready. There are moments when heaven and earth seem to blur, when something sacred presses in close and your soul just knows, this is it. You'd been walking in the rhythm of that expectation for weeks now. Everything around you felt as though it were aligning with something invisible, yet entirely real. The air carried weight, like a storm about to break open. Not in destruction, but in destiny. Then it happened. Not dramatic, not loud, no booming voice or angel with a flaming sword. Just presence, divine orchestration. You saw them, in person, and for a second, just a second, time slowed. The name, the one Michael had delivered like a scroll etched in fire, the one you'd prayed over, cried over, surrendered 100 times. There they were, flesh and blood, real, standing in front of you like prophecy with skin on. It was ordinary yet divine. No music played, no lights flickered. But your spirit screamed, pay attention, this is holy ground. They didn't know it yet, not fully. Maybe they sensed something. Maybe they had felt that spiritual brush like you had. But this wasn't the time to announce anything. This wasn't your cue to blurt out revelations or chase clarity. This was your cue to steward the moment, because heaven moves with honor. And you weren't going to fumble what God had so carefully constructed. So you smiled, spoke gently, stayed present. You didn't flinch, didn't let your emotions hijack the encounter. You simply let the moment breathe. You let God speak louder than your excitement. And afterward, when it was over, you didn't spiral. You went home, got quiet, and you worshipped, not because everything was confirmed, but because your peace was. And that was enough. The temptation to rush in was real. The urge to say something, do something, force a door open. But your spirit knew better now. That kind of love is reckless, not righteous. And this was a holy thing. You weren't going to mess with the recipe God had perfected in the secret place. You went back to prayer. But not the kind of prayer that begs, the kind of prayer that declares. You began to prophesy over them, not as someone obsessed with being chosen, but as someone aligned with heaven's intent. You didn't need them to validate your vision. You needed God to confirm his timing. And that's exactly what he began to do. Not through obvious signs, but through the fruit of stillness, a settled heart, a grounded spirit, a fierce sense of protection over what God had revealed. You didn't need to prove anything. You didn't even need to understand everything. You were learning that peace doesn't come from knowing. It comes from trusting. And so, while the world was telling you to shoot your shot, you stood still. Because sometimes, the boldest move isn't chasing, it's waiting with intention. You still lived your life, still served, still laughed, still walked in purpose. But there was now a quiet confidence beneath it all, a holy awareness that something was unfolding. You were in a sacred timeline and heaven was holding the pen. And every once in a while you'd get a glimpse, a post, a story, a sentence they said in passing. Nothing obvious, but your spirit would leap. Like John leaping in Elizabeth's womb when Mary walked in the room. Recognition without explanation. Your promise was near. It was breathing. Still, you weren't idolizing the promise. You had fallen more in love with the promiser, because whether they showed up in a month or a year, your heart was steady, no longer tossed around by what-ifs or doubts. You didn't need a ring to feel chosen. You didn't need a title to feel whole. You knew who you were and whose you were. That's what made you dangerous in the spirit. You weren't moving from lack. You were moving from abundance, and deep down you could sense that they were being stirred too. The spirit was moving on both sides, pulling heartstrings, shaping moments, breaking distractions, healing old wounds, softening defenses, tuning both your hearts to the same frequency. Because heaven doesn't just deliver a promise, it prepares both parties for the weight of it. And this was going to be weighty, not heavy in burden, but in glory. So you continued to pray, not out of desperation, but out of reverence. You covered them like they were already yours, not in entitlement, but in honor. You prayed for their clarity, their peace, their courage, because when they came, you didn't want them hesitant. You wanted them whole, bold, ready. And until that day arrived, you would remain faithful in the field God had placed you in, because the same God who spoke the name is the God who knows exactly how and when to bring them to your side. And He doesn't need your panic. He just needs your yes. The days that followed carried an unusual kind of peace. You weren't waiting in agony anymore. You were watching closely, prayerfully, but with no sense of urgency to force anything. That's what happens when you finally understand that what's yours doesn't need to be chased. It will recognize you when the time is right. And so, you began to see the hand of God in the smallest places. An unexpected message. A moment of eye contact. A conversation you weren't supposed to overhear but did. God wasn't being loud, but He wasn't being silent either. He was weaving, thread by thread, quietly pulling the two of you into the same orbit. And even though there were still questions, plenty of them, there was one thing you knew for sure. The wind had shifted. This was not just a crush or a feeling. This was a knowing. And it wasn't born out of emotion. It was forged in prayer. Archangel Michael didn't come just to drop a romantic hint. He came as a heavenly strategist, a warrior, a protector of divine unions. And now looking back, you could see why his presence was so necessary. This connection would carry so much weight in the spirit that it required angelic reinforcement. You weren't just being paired for companionship. You were being commissioned for kingdom work. And the closer you got to the moment of convergence, the more clarity began to settle in. Not just about them, but about yourself. All the years of struggle, of spiritual pruning, of heartbreak and false starts, it all started to make sense. God hadn't been punishing you. He had been refining you, sculpting you into the kind of vessel who could carry the kind of love that wouldn't collapse under pressure. You had prayed for someone who could see you, truly see you. But now you had also become someone who could be seen, without hiding, without shrinking, without apologizing for your calling. That's what made this season feel so sacred. You weren't reaching for someone to complete you. You were opening your hands to receive someone who had been walking a parallel journey. Someone who had their own scars, their own promises, their own battles, but who had been shaped, just like you, by the hand of a faithful God. And when you crossed paths again, something was different. Their eyes lingered a little longer. Their words felt more intentional. The energy between you wasn't chaotic. It was calm, like two puzzle pieces finally meeting after years in separate boxes. They didn't say anything yet, not directly, but the atmosphere said enough. There was a pause in their spirit now. A hesitation, not from fear, but from reverence, like they too could feel something had shifted, and you didn't need them to rush. You had waited this long, and now you could wait just a little more, because what was unfolding didn't need to be forced. It needed to breathe. You continued your assignment. God didn't call you to put your life on hold. He called you to live it fully, right in the middle of the mystery. And so you did. You showed up in purpose. You kept walking in integrity. You poured into others, not from depletion, but from overflow. Because while marriage was on the horizon, mission was still the priority. You weren't just preparing for a wedding. You were being aligned for a movement, and Archangel Michael was still close. You felt him in moments when you should have been anxious, but peace held you instead. You sensed him when spiritual warfare tried to reappear. Old distractions, old fears, old voices. But they couldn't touch you anymore. Michael stood guard not just over you, but over the union God was preparing. This wasn't just about timing, it was about protection, because anything sent by heaven must be stewarded like treasure. And that meant not telling everyone, not broadcasting the name, not seeking validation from others who couldn't see what God had shown you in the secret place. You were no longer driven by public confirmation. You were anchored in private conviction. And as you carried this promise, something unexpected began to happen. Your prayers for them grew more powerful, more prophetic. You didn't just pray about them. You prayed for them with the authority of someone who had been granted heavenly insight. You covered their mind, their relationships, their assignments. You prayed that if anyone was in their life who didn't belong, God would remove them gently without chaos. You prayed that if they were afraid to take a step toward you, God would grant them courage. You prayed that when the moment came for conversation, it wouldn't be awkward or confusing, it would be clear. And most of all, you prayed that they would fall so deeply in love with God, they'd recognize His voice even more than they recognized yours. Because that's what love born from heaven looks like. It doesn't just connect hearts, it aligns callings. And as the days unfolded, you stopped counting time and started counting blessings. You could feel it coming. Not in a frantic way, in a holy, still way. God was about to do what only He could do, and all He needed was your continued yes. The day came, not like a roar, but like a whisper that turned into a wave. You felt it before you saw it, the subtle shift in the spirit, the hush that fell over your heart, the way your prayers seemed to settle into peace, even when you didn't have all the answers. God was moving, and then you saw them again. This time, the space between you was charged with something more than anticipation. It was destiny in motion. You didn't rush to fill the silence. You let the holy tension linger, like a sacred pause between two souls who already knew. The name, the one Michael had spoken, was no longer a secret or a mystery. It was a presence. You looked at them and saw more than the physical. You saw the battles they'd fought, the prayers they'd whispered in the dark. You saw the grace that had carried them through seasons no one else could understand. And you saw the reflection of your own journey. It was as if heaven had been working behind the scenes, stitching two broken paths into one seamless story. There was no need for grand declarations yet. No need for dramatic gestures. This was a moment of quiet surrender, a mutual recognition of something sacred unfolding. You both knew this wasn't just a meeting, it was a divine appointment. You felt the weight of the supernatural marriage pressing gently against the natural, reminding you that this union was more than love. It was legacy. As days turned into weeks, you began to navigate this new territory with intentionality. You guarded your hearts fiercely. You communicated with clarity. You moved with purpose, knowing that the enemy would try to infiltrate with doubt, fear, and confusion. But you stood firm, because the power behind this union was greater than any challenge. Archangel Michael's presence wasn't just a comfort, it was a shield. You could sense his warrior spirit walking beside you both, fending off attacks that sought to derail the divine plan. This marriage wasn't just about two people, it was about two destinies colliding to change the course of history. And as you journeyed together, you both grew stronger, not just as individuals, but as a team ordained by heaven. You began to pray together, worship together, and build a foundation rooted in faith. You learned to listen, not just with ears, but with hearts attuned to the Spirit. You discovered that supernatural marriage isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance. It's about choosing each other every day, even when the road is hard. It's about holding on to hope when circumstances look bleak. And most importantly, it's about surrendering your plans to God's greater purpose. Because this union was never meant to serve your own dreams alone. It was meant to serve a kingdom far bigger than yourselves. So you continued walking forward, hand in hand, heart in heart, knowing that the name you'd been given was no longer just a promise. It was a prophecy being fulfilled. And as you moved into the future, you carried with you the certainty that whatever came your way, God had already prepared you both, for a supernatural marriage ordained in heaven can never be undone on earth. Now you stand at the threshold of something incredible, something ordained by heaven itself, a supernatural marriage unlike any other. It's a union forged not just in flesh and blood but in the spirit, a marriage that carries the weight of destiny, purpose, and divine assignment. You've traveled a journey filled with waiting, prayer, refining, and revelation. And now the promise stands before you, radiant and real. Archangel Michael's words echo in your spirit like a battle cry and a blessing all at once. Look at this name now. That name, the one that once felt distant, almost like a whisper in the paw, dark, is now a light blazing before your eyes. It is the name that will be written in the book of life, a name tied to your heart forever. And it's not just a label, it's a story. A story of God's faithfulness, of supernatural timing, and of a love that defies logic and human understanding. You've learned through this journey that a supernatural marriage doesn't happen by accident. It's an act of divine orchestration, a masterpiece painted by the hand of God with care and precision. It requires faith when feelings fail, hope when the waiting seems endless, and courage when the enemy tries to sow doubt. But through it all, you've stood firm. You've learned that love born in heaven is patient. It is kind. It carries no record of wrongs. It protects, trusts, hopes, and perseveres. It is not self-seeking but sacrificial. And it's this kind of love that will carry you both forward, no matter what storms may come. The supernatural marriage you're stepping into is a partnership designed to impact generations. It is a calling as much as a covenant. Together you will walk in authority, shine with the light of God's glory, and stand as a testament to the power of divine union. And remember, Archangel Michael is not just a messenger. He is your warrior, your protector, your guide. His presence surrounds you both as you enter this new season. There will be battles, but you will not fight alone. You will have heavenly help, strength beyond your own, and peace that surpasses understanding. So embrace the name, speak it with boldness, celebrate the promise, because the supernatural marriage ordained for you is no longer a distant dream. It is your present reality, and as you walk forward hand in hand, heart to heart, never forget this truth. God's plans for you are perfect. His timing is flawless, and His love is eternal. This is your story, your destiny. A supernatural marriage ordained in heaven, and it is just the beginning.